Hi, this is Ian Wright here. Just going to do a podcast on anxiety. I'm going to call this one The Bear. I'm in the process right now of starting to put together a series of 4 books, which I hope are going to be audiobooks as well, on anxiety. Because for me, it's the fundamental thing that's affecting our modern society these days, and it causes a great deal of distress to a lot of the people I see in my practice. And in these books, I'm going to be looking at some techniques I've developed over the years around remodeling anxiety, and it's going to be based on really the neuroscience of anxiety, keeping it very simple, and it's going to be structured around specific techniques, some of them contemplative, visualization, working with stillness, working with perceptual changes, sensory changes, stuff that I've explored to some degree in the dynamics of stillness, but this is going to be slightly more focused on specific parts of the brain, which are key areas in an anxiety pattern. This is such a huge subject that I'm just going to give a couple of indications. There's so much involved, and there's, I think, so much that we can actually work with and do with it. And anyway, I've entitled this The Bear, and I'll get to that. Anxiety is almost, you could look at it as a misinterpretation or an overreaction of our nervous systems to a potential perceived or real threat. As I've talked about previously, when we are born, when we are first developing our sensory awareness, our senses become attuned to detecting 2 things within our environment. Number 1 is there a threat? And if there's a threat, we apply action to this. Or is there nurture? And if there's nurture, we head towards it in terms of food, suckle, warmth, love, etc., etc. Threats we know about. As the brain wires up, there are 3 main parts of our human brains and mammalian brains as well. There is the brainstem, the old brain, which gives us reflex reactions. For example, you put your hand out, touch something hot, and via the spinal cord and the brainstem, there's a direct reaction. This is unconscious. This is an unconscious reaction. Very direct. We don't even have to think about it. Then we've got the subcortical areas, which are sort of the middle parts of the brain, which involve parts like the midbrain, and parts of the limbic system, the amygdala, hippocampus, etc., and the pituitary and hypothalamus, certain parts of the brain which are kind of switchbacks. These are, again, pre-conscious. So, for example, in threat, the amygdala is very involved, which is a little part of the brain that sits underneath the frontal lobes. And when there is a perceived threat in the environment, the amygdala, through the hypothalamus, sets out a response, a direct response. There's a wild animal in the environment. We'll respond to that before we think about it. So it's a or subconscious level of reactivity. And our brains are wired to do this. Then we, of course, have the cortex, which is the latest stage of brain development which brings us consciousness, which is awareness and self-awareness. Now, in the brain, when the brain's wired, these different areas interplay with each other. So, for example, the cortex brings in thinking and sensory awareness, and it's complex. I'm not going to go into the actual details of how these layers of the brain interact, but our consciousness can alter our responses to a real or perceived threat. Now, this idea in anxiety and in human anxiety, there is often a series of issues, some of which are present or all of which are present. Number one is this idea of uncertainty, because our fear response, which is a withdrawal or a fight, flight, fright response, which is mediated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, plus other parts of the nervous system, the motor areas, give us this direct reaction, which is a reaction to preserve ourselves. So there's the idea of real threat, and then there's the idea of perceived threat in the environment. Something that we think is a threat. For example, if we see something, our memory, we bring in another part of the brain called the hippocampus, which gives us a working memory, an understanding of the context by which the perceived threat. So, for example, we see a wild animal, and our memory goes, wild animal equals danger, boom, we have a reaction. The problems with anxiety starts to come when a few of these different areas aren't functioning correctly. For example, there is a misconception of perceived threat. For example, an over-valuation of a perceived threat, or an impaired ability to distinguish threat from safety, or an overreactivity to that said threat. So these perceptual difficulties when it comes down to threat, and often in anxiety, there is no real threat, but we're looking at and we're projecting our consciousness into the idea of something which gives us a sense of uncertainty. For example, an uncertainty about the future, or a perceived future. So what happens is we're bringing in our thinking, conscious, cortical part of our brain to give us a sense of, okay, I'm concerned and I'm worried about the potential outcome of a certain situation. And so we spend a lot of time working with this particular issue when there is anxiety. Now, this comes into the idea and the world of beliefs. Beliefs are hugely important in terms of interjecting into these lower subcortical areas of the brain fear reaction responses, which bypass down through the system and provide reaction. It's very interesting. Nowadays, there has been a huge kind of development in our thinking about belief and how it affects our biology. For example, the modern biological areas of cell membrane biology and epigenetics has almost turned our thinking about our biology on our heads, in that we start to see that it's not our genetics that drives us completely. It's what is around our genetics, the epigenetics, which is the localized environment. And the localized environment can also include our thoughts, beliefs, which make up our sense of feelings and our feelings about ourselves. The way we sense and the way we feel, our sense of self, and the way our body senses ourself is a whole big subject, which I'll talk about in another podcast, and I'm going to talk about in the book. But our beliefs have this huge effect on our system. Now, fascinating areas of research that are happening at the moment in terms of placebo and the placebo effects that are classically known as, if you give someone a fake pill instead of the real pill, they can have a potential reaction to that, and so it can actually help someone. So if you give half the people one pill and half the people a pill that doesn't have anything, it's like a placebo and it has a neutral substance in it, the thinking around it is that it can actually have a very similar effect. So what that shows is that our beliefs and our thinking are having a direct effect on physiological body responses. For example, a classic piece of research on the placebo effect, which was incredible, was done by a guy called Mosley in 2002, and he did some research on knees. He was a surgeon, and he was trying to work out what actually helped, what part of the surgery. He knew that surgery helped knee function, but he didn't quite know what part of the surgery was important. So he split his patients into 3 groups. And the criteria for the surgery was that they had severe knee pain. The first group, he opened them up, scraped their cartilage, washed it out. The knee, sewed it back up. The second group, he just opened it up, washed it out, and closed it up. The third group, he opened the knee, pretended he was doing something, and closed it again. Now, the interesting thing about this is all 3 groups responded exactly the same way to the surgery. So they all, within statistical balance, they all got better. And this is incredible if you think about it. It's amazing. Now, in the other way of looking at it is the idea of the nocebo, which is a negative. A placebo is a positive belief saying this will help you, and because our belief system engages with that, it does help us. So it changes our beliefs, affect our biology. In a nocebo, it does the opposite. For example, there was some research carried out in Italy where they were looking at atenolol, which is a beta blocker, which helps the heart function and blood pressure, etc. Now, there is a side effect of atenolol, which is impotence. But the interesting thing that they did is they replaced this in some of the people with an inert pill, but still gave the warning that this could cause impotence. And in others, they gave no warning. So they had sort of 4 different groups of patients. But what they showed quite conclusively was that actually the impotence, only 1/10 of the impotence was caused by the drug. 90% of the impotence was caused by the belief that the drug may cause impotence. So the belief gave you 90% of the dysfunction. This is incredible. I mean, if you really sit and think about that, it shows that the intense, incredible power of our beliefs and how they can affect us. Now, I just want to talk about this experience that I had, which shows the power of belief quite clearly. I was running, the end of last summer, I was running up in the woods near the sea in southern Tuscany. I was running with my partner, and we were running through the woods. Anyway, when I was running, I looked up, and about 50 yards up the path, not the path we were running on, but the path up the hill, I looked up and I saw what I thought in my mind was a bear. Right? It was clearly a bear, huge, big bear, brown bear, that was just looking back at me on its fours. It had one paw up, and it was kind of on a kind of tree stump. It was kind of, kind of moving. And I looked down, looked away, and carried on running, and thought nothing of it. Now, the interesting thing is our senses, and our senses are hugely important with regards to anxiety, which I'll come to. But I had no conscious belief that there were bears in Italy. I thought brown bears did not come from Italy. There was no such thing. So I looked at a bear and I looked away thinking that must be my imagination. I didn't even register it. I ran on. Anyway, I turned back and I said to my partner, I said, Mara, it had this weird kind of sense that I saw a bear, but I said, but I can't have, because there's no such thing as bears in Tuscany. And she said, yes, there are. There are definitely bears. And so the thing that struck me mostly about that, actually, and it was a beautiful bear, was that I did not believe my eyes. So I saw a bear, clearly saw a bear. When thinking back on it, it was definitely a bear. And when we got actually back to where we were staying, they were talking about that they were hunting these bears and blah, 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 because they were coming too close to tourists, etc., which was terrible. I never told them that I'd seen this bear because I didn't want this poor thing hunted. But I didn't believe my eyes, because it wasn't within my belief system or structure that there could be a bear where we were running, which, it's amazing, really. And if you think about the power and the potential power of belief in our thinking and our consciousness. Now, this is where belief is very important when it comes into dealing and working with anxiety. Because what we believe to be a threat becomes a threat, be it real or not. So actually, how we interject our beliefs and our perceptual beliefs into that process can actually affect our reaction, our physiological reaction. I'm very interested in the physiological pathways and the physiological reactions of anxiety and fear. So, this gives us a lot of potential places to change our perceptions. But what this has to do, and what's very much involved with this, is this idea of consciousness. Consciousness means self-awareness, really. It is what our cortical areas of the brain bring us, is consciousness. But one of the many different techniques involved in directly working with anxiety is to bring consciousness to supposedly unconscious reactions. So actually, our consciousness can cause us trouble, but our consciousness, if we apply it correctly, can change patterns by changing belief structures and repatterning the brain. The interesting thing that happens in the amygdala, which is a huge area, which is the kind of, in a way, it's the control center of our threat responses. It's that with the hypothalamus, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which actually acts as a brake to this fear response, and is hugely important when you're looking at teenage brains, actually. And I'm going to do a whole book on teenage brains and anxiety. It's very important. All these areas are very, very key in our response. But what I was saying is the amygdala actually changes shape. It can remodel itself. So they talk about brain plasticity. It's another huge subject, which is remodeling of the brain. And it was originally thought that brains cannot remodel, apart from, of course, the hippocampus and certain areas of the temporal lobe, which can remodel in response to learning. Learning is a process by our brains literally rewire. That is how we learn, is by our brains rewiring. Anyway, this rewiring and this synaptic rewiring happens in the amygdala in terms of fear responses. So we can actually repattern pattern or remodel our brains by looking very precisely at these particular threat responses, perceived or real, and starting to change them. Now, there are techniques that are already available which can be helpful with this. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness training. Some of these ideas can help us bring some sort of consciousness to this. But I'm interested in doing more specific exercises which can actually remodel these parts of the brain with perceptual changes. And to me it's an absolutely fascinating subject, and there's so much work to be done on it, and I just wanted to give you a little introduction. But for now, I'm digging away at working at these books. One of them is going to be for adults. The second one is going to be for teenagers, because teenage brains work very, very differently than adult brains, and that's why there are certain responses in teenagers that are more normal, and they are normal. And actually, we don't know this, and teenagers don't realize that their brains actually are behaving physiologically differently because of changes in their prefrontal cortex and some of their dopamine pathways. What I'm interested in is helping us to understand how our brains work and how we can address areas that cause dysfunction, some of these loopings that happen in anxiety disorders. The third book I'm going to do is going to be for children, which I'm going to do as a comic style. So I'm going to simplify some of these techniques that we're working with into ones that can be accessed for sort of 7, 8, 9-year-olds, because actually it's amazing how many 7-year-olds onwards that I see with anxiety disorders these days. It's incredibly common and increasingly common. So anyway, that's a huge subject, which I'll come back to. The fourth one actually is anxiety in the elderly, which is a whole nother subject in itself as well. Physiologically and psychologically, there's a whole different world going on as anxiety grows sometimes when people get older. And that's something I really want to focus on as well. I think it's an important area. Anyway, I'll come back to all of this stuff at a later time. I wish you well.